Well, let's go ahead and get started then. So my name is Vivian Borchescu. I am one of the account executives here at ExecVision, and I will be hosting today's session called Mining for Gold, the data that dictates measurable performance improvements. This session is part of our inaugural Momentum 2020 event, so thank you all so much for attending. We are very excited to bring you an amazing lineup of speakers that you can learn from to optimize your team's performance and drive better business outcomes. Thank you also especially to our event sponsors. We've got Outreach, ZoomInfo, Connect and Sell, Aircall, Sapper Consulting, ScaleX, and Speckit. Please visit our sponsor page on the Momentum event website to learn more about these great organizations. Really quick before we kick off, we are recording this session and we will be sharing it along with the deck after the event concludes. If you have any technical issues, please enter them into the chat window and I'll do my best to help you out. And if you have any questions for the speakers, please share them in the Q&A window. Now, first to start off, I would like to introduce your host, Jim Dickey. Jim began his career more than 30 years ago with the IBM and Sterling software before launching 2 successful software companies. On top of being at the forefront of sales research and leadership, Jim is an animal rights advocate supporting primarily the Morris Animal Foundation in Colorado. Jim, it's an honor to have you here with us today. I'll turn it over to you to begin the session and to introduce the panelists.
Thank you, Vivian, and thanks everyone again for joining us today. And if I can just get control, I think I've got control of the slides.
Let me turn it over.
There we go.
There you go, you should be set.
Doesn't seem to want to advance. There, okay, here we go. Perfect. So today I'm really happy to be joined by, well, we were there for a second, by our panelists today. We got Chris Beal. Chris is the Chief Executive Officer of Connect and Sell. And by the way, I've asked each one of these panelists to do a brief introduction of themselves when they get around to talking so you understand their perspective. We've got Heather Combs, again, joining us in DC, who's the COO of 3 Pillar Global. Matt Hoffman, Chief Revenue Officer for CN, and also Brian Patel, who's running sales development for ZoomInfo. And so we've got a good perspective on what's going to go on in the world of sales today. But more importantly, what we want to do is start talking about data and how do we mine that to get better at how we sell. So I'm going to just share one chart with you, and then I'll stop talking and move on to the panel on what's the level of change that's impacting sales today. And then we're going to take a look at what the panelists think about what are the KPIs we should be measuring once we get that data. How do we actually do something with it? How do we turn it into insights? And then how do we get those insights turned into action out in the sales organization? And how do we keep this happening on and on and on as a continuous improvement culture? And I think the reason that's important is when you take a look at the data that we had from our most recent study, we went out, hopefully we don't have to do this every time, but we are now. We went out and we surveyed about 350 organizations, and we asked them, what types of change are your sales organization seeing today? And by the way, is that change good or bad for you? And so we're all aware of the fact that with the COVID situation, we're seeing changes in the economy, most of it negative. You know, some companies like Zoom are having banner years, hospitality industry, travel industry, not so much. But there's also changes in our customers' world, in their marketplace, but also in their expectations of us. There's changes in the competitive landscape, and then there's self-induced changes where we change our product line. Most of the time that's for the better, but it's still change. And the key thing is this really drives home. We live in a frail ecosystem in sales. It'd be great if it was one and done. We could just figure out how to go sell and we just keep doing wash, rinse, repeat, but that's not the reality. So it's agility and adaptability are the 2 watchwords today. And the key question becomes, how do you do that? You know, hopefully it's going to be driven by data versus hunches. But where does that data come from? So let's start by exploring the 4 questions that we talked about doing today. And the first one is, what are the metrics we should measure? You know, what are the things that we should be focusing on? Because there's a ton of metrics that are available in the world of sales, but what are the most meaningful? And Brian, since I introduced you last, why don't we start up with you and tell us what you kind of are looking at in terms of looking at the BDR function at ZoomInfo. What are you guys starting to measure?
Yeah, thanks, Jim. I think there's a few metrics that have been really critical through COVID that we started to measure as a sales development team. For anyone out there, we have about 170 SDRs here at ZoomInfo, and about 140 of those are new business, and about 30 are working on upsells in the customer base. I think the two biggest metrics that we look at now, which has been extremely critical, is, I guess, three. The first would be out of office rate. So I know that sounds minute, not a big deal, but when you're really looking to leverage true connects on the phone and true email land, the out of office rate is something we've actually taken a look at quite closely. Another one is just general connect rate. So looking at connect rate across days, hours. I mean, Chris Beal on this call, I'm sure that's probably a focal point for him as well. But connect rate is always critical for an SDR team to understand when is the best time to call, how often should we be calling in that hour. And the other piece, just learning about this COVID landscape is like, it's hard to understand at all times. Well, how is PTO affected? How about long vacations? How about when the morning starts, the day ends? And so we've been looking really closely at what we call completion rate. So once that meeting is scheduled, what are our rates looking like for when they actually show up? And hopefully that leads to an opportunity. So those are three that we always cared about, but with COVID are things that we're caring more about to really try to, level up here during this pandemic. So those are three that we really focus on, Jim.
Chris, Matt, Heather, what are you guys thinking about? Why don't we go with you, Chris?
Yeah, well, we're kind of inside the conversation, folks. So connect rates are hugely important. I like to look at, as I look at our leaderboard, which really isn't a leaderboard like do better kind of thing. It's a leaderboard like let the CEO look at it and see how the company's doing today. I want to know the basics. I want to know how many dials, how many connects, how many conversations, how many follow-ups, how many meetings got set, how long my reps are waiting for the next conversation and connect and sell. They push a button. Normally they'll wait 5 minutes. Today, by the way, they're waiting about 10 minutes. Today, dial to connect's huge. It's about 60 on their list. And I've already asked some research folks to take a look at that and do something about it if they can. And if they can't, then we're going to live with it. And then I also want to look inside the conversation. So an example is, which of my reps has the highest busy callback rate right now for the conversations they've had so far today? Because I want to know whose voice might have gotten a little tense with all this COVID stuff and they don't sound good enough to stay on the phone with. And stack ranking across the group rather than having absolute measures can tell you who to focus on for coaching. So some of that stuff's kind of around the conversation, some of it's inside.
Yeah, and on our side, we think there's many parts to a high-performing sales organization, right people, right process, right strategy. But today, the underlying backbone of all of it is the right data. Data is the foundation for customer acquisition. So it's not to say that there's no art in practicing sales or understanding what we're going to get to and which KPIs drive an organization, but much of what defines, our most outstanding sales reps is our ability to deeply understand what's required to engage prospect, to speak to them directly. And more often than not, you'll find that there's a lot more to it with data that goes beyond their sales quota.
And I think we come in kind of right after where Matt is. So 3Pillar is a product development company. We help other organizations monetize their data and build the products that companies use. So if you've booked a bike on your SoulCycle class, or you parked at a Park Mobile Pay app, that's the kind of thing that we build. And so we use data to better understand the customer experience and ensure that we're building products that have fantastic user experience that increase the number of users you have and the times they repeat and how long they stay with your product. So we work with companies like NPR, who if you ask Alexa what the news is in the morning, she'll read you the report. And NPR has done fantastic things with understanding who stays on to a podcast for how long and when they drop off. And then understanding that is great for, say, advertisers on if that's the right place for you. It's really understanding that.
I think you're bringing up, Heather, I think you're bringing up a really good point too. It's not just the metrics of what our sales organization is doing, it's also metrics around what our customers are doing. And just want to know what any of the other panelists are doing around that thing in terms of also gathering information about the potential buyers or existing customers.
Absolutely.
Yeah, we suck at that, so I'm not gonna say we do anything there very well. We just rely on ZoomInfo to give us good data, and then we're happy.
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing we do, Jim, is taking a closer look at your customer data and trying to pick up trends in that data. Obviously that affects my department, but even more so for the business is trying to understand what are some of the trends that you showed in that first chart, Jim, right? Like, I think your chart is a good overarching idea and getting an understanding of what's going on out there, but I think every business is different. And so if I'm surrounded by a bunch of C-level folks in this call, so I guess I'm the junior person, but if I was C-level, I'd be, and if my role was in that, it's something valuable to look at that data, understanding, are there certain industries that are increasing revenue, decreasing? How can you make up that? Is there a certain product in your product suite offering that you can help to upsell? So I think just understanding that customer data more, you got someone in-house, take a look at it, and great. If you don't, it's probably worth the investment to find someone good that can understand data in mass and pick up your own customer, data trends.
I mean, it starts with that understanding though, right? So to your point, regardless of your title, right? If you're looking at a sales leader, that means you have to be able to interpret and use the data, right, with your team and your organization, understanding how to interpret it and what is it, what are the catalysts that are actually driving meaningful outcomes, right? And you be comfortable understanding the data behind your pipeline to even be able to get to that point, right? So it's your ability to turn, numbers like, leads, volume and win rates and ARPA into actionable plans that impact the bottom line. And if you're forecasting short on your bookings targets, do you know how you'll make up the difference? I mean, that's not a rhetorical question, right? So it's actually understanding what's driving that.
Yeah, Matt, I mean, I've actually worked for businesses like that before where the forecast came from a gut instinct. And you're like, how do we get there? I'm confused, at least to miss goals, at least to frustration, at least to poor employee retention. So you're right. I mean, Matt, you're right. Any title, obviously, jokes aside, understanding from the newest SDR all the way up to C-level on all the data that's going to get you the end result is critical. Couldn't agree more.
Yeah, I mean, sales leaders in 2021 making critical decisions based on hunches, it will cost you your job. So you have to be able to figure out, how to bring in and get access to this information to make meaningful decisions that are backed by data, meaningful data.
And I think, Matt, you're leading into the next thing that we wanted to discuss, which was, taking a look at, I am doing something wrong, but advancing this down to the next stage, which is how do we get this data and actually turn it into meaningful insights, to something that we can actually go and utilize and make new decisions on. And I'm curious, I was talking with one of our research clients, and they said they were doing a big project right now because they found that their no decision rate had doubled. Pre-COVID, their forecast no decision rate was 15% of all deals. Now it's up to 30%. So I've got data. I know the numbers change. What do I do about it? How do I find out what's behind that? So what are some of the things you guys are doing to go in and analyze the data that you're utilizing, you're finding, and actually turn it into things that you could then make decisions off of it, as you talk about, Matt?
I think this is one of those places that it's not only important to have volumes of data, it's important to layer that data on some actual anecdotal and survey-based research. So you want the customers to talk to you. You want to talk, whether that's through surveys or customer calls or real-time interaction. You have to understand the trend of the data and then what you can do about it. And I think that requires some human-human interaction to layer on top of all those numbers.
That's right. That's how you avoid those sort of beware of headline KPIs, right? So it can be tempting to focus on like the dashboard or that headline KPI, but if, to your point, if you really can dig in and understand what's happening underneath that, you will get a better outcome.
Yeah, one thing we can all do who have products is instrument our products to give us back data that's not just focused on usage, but how much value are our customers actually getting from our products, and have that data be front and center for us. And I think, in the SaaS world, a lot of times I think we seem to have a tendency to focus on adoption and say, oh, they're adopting, investors care about adoption a lot, therefore we should care about adoption a lot, right? But at the customer end, the question is, what are they getting out of it? I mean, so our product's kind of easy. It's like, are they getting meetings? But also, are they getting referrals? Are they, are they actually having the conversations? Are they learning from the conversations? So when I said we suck at it, that's the part we don't suck at. Actually, we're pretty good at watching our customers. I'm looking right now at a flight school result. Flight school is something we offer to help people learn how to have great conversations. And I can look at that and go, hey, this customer, brand new customer, is probably going to move forward with us because in their flight school, they went from a 6% conversion rate to 15.84%, and they're pretty good across the board. So, you know, that's real data that tells me something about a trajectory with a customer. And I think our products can tell us a lot. And then when we're working with other products like ExecVision, we can go in and say, okay, so what happened in the meetings that ended up moving forward compared to the ones that didn't without us having an opinion? And it's not just the length of the conversations or whatever, but this is where some machine learning, I think, can really come to bear. Just make a couple cohorts and, you know, ask them a question.
Yeah, Chris.
I think that's right, Chris. It also gives you an opportunity in this environment to quickly A/B test all kinds of theories. So if you see a couple of things happening, you've got a chance to take a group and work some different alternatives and see what resonates quickly.
Yeah, I think Chris, what you said is really valuable when you think about connect and sell. I think sometimes when you look at data, sort of the instinctive thing to do and the easy answer to do oftentimes is just add headcount, right? But like connect and sell is one way that's out there, and it's a good way. You used it before, it's a solid product. Is a lot of times you can look at the data and drive efficiency, right? So when you're looking at your sales team, you know, it's not always, point being, it doesn't always just need to be, oh, I need more SDRs, or I just need more recruiters, I need this or that. And headcount, which is obviously an expense to your business, a lot of times it's motivating and understanding that actually you can drive more efficiency through the same amount of headcount. And I think that's something that is difficult at times to do when you're so solid and stuck on, I need this person for this role to help this. But there are strategic ways out there to make your current staff more efficient through data.
Well, I think a couple of you mentioned the fact that, you know, this is, you know, starting to give us insights into what our people are doing, what our customers are doing. But there's also, as you brought up, Heather, the idea of saying, let's go to have one-on-one interaction. And so I'm curious, it's what you guys are doing. When we find one of your salespeople's got a better conversion rate than others, are we going and talking to this person and we're getting best practices from them on what they're actually doing? And how do we go about then turning that into something that we could utilize across the sales force? I'm just kind of curious as to experiences you have with your own organizations.
Well, I mean, I'll start off by saying I think the traditional or conventional one-on-one is wasting twice the amount of time as it probably should, both for managers and reps. You know, and so you've got all of the challenges of digging into what's really happening underneath the surface to actually try and provide that meaningful one-on-one. And you got to do that before you have that meeting, right? So, you know, that we go back to sort of the data-driven assessment of what is true meaningful selling. And I want to be able to understand all of these different products and how they're impacting the ecosystem of ultimately making that rep more successful, so you don't have to just add more headcount to your previous point. But what is the true meaningful selling activity? Drilling in on that. And then that is how you can then elevate the middle, right? So you look at that sort of adage of, you know, 80% of your revenue comes from the top 20% of your reps. Well, you know, what if you could actually move the needle on the middle average, you know, even a few points, because every single rep is different. Every single deal is a little bit different. And so if you could dig into sort of those intangible factors of each individual person and coach that, you could provide a more meaningful one-on-one in half the time. And I think that that's going to be really, really important as teams are working in a more distributed capacity going into next year.
Yeah,
I think 101's, oh, sorry. Go right ahead.
Hot topic.
Well, I just love I love your 101 comment there, Matt. It wastes actually probably 10 times as much time because there's all the prep for something that shouldn't have happened in the first place. And meanwhile, when you're talking about sales, a lot of the action, that's why ExecVision's in business, right? You guys are zoom in for our business to give us the data so we can go have conversations with people. ExecVision's helping us understand what's going on in those conversations. But guess what? Once the conversation is over, your opportunity for coaching declines rapidly. And being able to catch somebody at that moment. Yesterday, I look a couple times a day at what's going on with our busy callbacks. And I just click through whoever has the most, and I listen to a couple of their conversations. And one of our reps had dropped off dramatically in performance, but it didn't show up quite yet in a way that you go, oh, that's performance, right? Clicking through, listening, he'd changed the second line of the script from, can I have 27 seconds to tell you why I called, to, do you have 27 seconds so I can tell you why I called? And everybody was dropping off, right? He didn't even know he'd done it. That little piece of drift right there, anybody who's ever played a sport knows when your coach watches you, he sees stuff that you're doing that you don't know that you changed. And if we don't do it in that kind of, let data help us get to the point of action where things are really happening, and then say, my hypothesis is you changed like that, right? So you got your right elbow going out of the backswing. I don't think you're going to come back from the top on that golf swing. Thank you very much. And I think we need to use data to support coaching in real time much more than let's have a meeting once a week.
Any coach will tell you what the player does at practice, the player will do in the game. And so anything that you can have that allows you to be able to take action and provide that coaching essentially in real time when the moment's hot, is going to ensure on a much more rapid rate than, weekly or biweekly or, need I say, monthly one-on-ones with those reps to then go back retroactively, 100%.
Yeah, the one-on-one topic too, there's, we haven't discussed it yet, but there's just the cost of it too. I mean, you just call your manager or VP or director, whatever. They're probably the person that's owning these one-on-ones. There's a cost for them not to be, with their other team members, coaching and training. And so I would just say there's plenty of creative ways to turn the one-on-ones into 25-to-1s. And, for example, something I always try to give the audience something you can actually take away from this is everyone's got something conferencing now that has a recording feature on it. And if you think about, what truly you want to provide to your team for enrichment, when COVID first hit, and shockingly enough, we had a bit of a hit on our completion rate. So people weren't showing up to our meetings at high as rates as we've seen before. Maybe it's a little lackadaisical from home. Maybe it's my kids crying, I'm going to go handle that instead of meet with ZoomInfo. What we did is we took a look at our 7 highest performing SDRs for good show rate or completion rate. And we actually had a panel just like this with them. And we said, hey, what are you doing during the call, during discovery? What are you doing after the meeting set? How are you using the invite to leverage messaging? We've had 7 people, and then we had 7 people educate 170. We recorded it, and it was just a homework over the weekend. We didn't lose 170 people off the phones. We didn't have one-on-ones with 170 people. But what a low cost, low risk thing to do, or having 7 your best educate 170 sort of as homework over the weekend. So that's one thing we've done too, to sort of scale back some of the one-on-ones.
Yeah, and I was just going to encourage us to remember, I think the one-on-one points are great, and working internally on the individual sales reps. But I think that if we don't talk to our customers, we don't know what the customers want and what the experience that they're getting, we can train people up fantastically to do exactly what we want them to do, which might not be what the market wants to buy. So doing anything you can to get real-time actionable thoughts from your customer base, whether that's watching how they actually interact with a product, if you've got that possibility through something that's digital, or to having customer interviews, or having them, having somebody watch in the real world environment. Finding that out to really balance out what you want to be teaching reps and others to do, I think is an important part of it.
Yeah, 100%. I love that you mentioned actually talking to the customer because they're the ones that are going to give you ultimately the best feedback if you can actually get it out of them, and being able to use that to augment the coaching practices that you have. That will ensure that you're getting to the core of the message you need to have to kind of drive that action, right? And I find a lot of times, you're sort of thinking from the mindset of whatever that sales playbook you're trying to go through with your question-based selling and paraphrasing and going through everything that you've been taught, but actually stopping and listening and hearing from them, what's really resonating. I think that's a big part of where you'll start to see, as distributed sales teams, call an account executive or a sales professional, even you're going to need to be able to transition into personalization, even in the sense that you're not completely separated from your brand, but in the sense that you are a trusted advisor. So you are actually, you can put your mind, into the mind of your buyer, and you can sort of predetermine or think ahead on challenges that they're going to have and already have solutions to sort of build that trust with them and get them there.
Yeah, we just recently did a feedback call with a big buyer, somebody who went through the process and said yes quickly and easily, and somebody who also said no, and really contrasted what it was that they felt their experience was across that. What things stood out to make them go with the decision they did, and we learned an awful lot about an actual conversation and what it feels like to be on the other side.
I think, man, you're both bringing up something really important, about this thing about how do we turn those insights into something going forward? Because my business partner, Barry Trailer, always goes nuts when people say practice makes perfect, because he said that's wrong. He says practice makes permanent. He says perfect practice makes perfect. And so as we go to the next topic down here, Vivian, could you advance it? Just one slide. This whole idea of how do we turn these insights into action? And I think that's really the key thing. We gather feedback from clients, we gather feedback from our reps, but we're also going to human beings. And so we're going to ask you and say, hey, we want you to change how you're doing your job. And so we got to realize, how do we invite them into that change process? Because maybe, hey, we need to go out and start calling higher in the organization now because of COVID. We need to go out and engage the CFO because he or she has become the CFO in today's world. And they're going to turn down all the things that we're going to ask them to buy. So we tell them these things, but how do we ensure they actually go do that? Because we may be asking them to get outside of their comfort zone. So this is kind of an extension of the coaching conversation, but what can we do to actually get people to go in and start utilizing those new techniques, the new strategies, the new tactics that the marketplace is demanding that we use today?
Yeah, that's a great point. Like defining your sales KPIs, and understanding that you need to have good data with which to be able to do so. But, KPIs alone won't take your business to the next level. And I think a lot of times what ends up happening in discussions like this is there's a whole element of like business culture, internally, depending on how large the organization is, there's a people challenge first, right? So I would think, translating, the data into action starts with securing executive buy-in, right? To be an effective sales leader, you have to work within the organization, that, has to then bubble up with what the strategic objectives are of the company at the highest level, right? You have to be competent in translating this data and these KPIs, right, into new initiatives to where it can make sense for the executive team. If you can't do that, then it won't get very far. So I would
is that ever the truth?
I would definitely start with getting that buy-in, and then you from there you go to turn product launches into revenue, and then looking at where the data can actually be harnessed to take it to that next level.
Yeah, I think that's key. The other thing I think that we can do that's helpful is recognize that we're trying to improve a process. Stuff flows through the process, right? It has inputs, it has things that happen to those inputs, and finally we get an output. And we kind of like one output over the others, which is a new booking, close one business, renewal, whatever it is. But the fact is, all processes, and this is mathematically true, have a simple constraint. They don't have 23 constraints. They have exactly one constraint. Each process has one constraint. Everything you work on that is not that constraint is at that moment a waste of time and resource. So until you identify the constraint in your sales process, you're working on the wrong stuff by definition. So KPIs by definition are almost all irrelevant except for the one that talks about your constraint. And if you don't draw that process map and go find out, and by the way you do it, first go read The Theory of Constraints by Goldratt, otherwise you're clueless. And then find out where the inventory is building up before a step and where the downstream step is starved. And there's your bottleneck, there's your constraint. Go get data around that, focus hard on that thing. I found in a lot of cases, the constraint on whole sales organizations is the effectiveness of the first 7 seconds of the first conversation. It's very short. It's kind of like, who would think it? But when you do the math, that's often where the constraint is. It can be other places too, but find the constraint and get executive buy-in around simply understanding and changing one thing rather than going after 23 things.
Yeah. Another question for you is, what would you do if you said, if we have to be able to identify the constraint and, we're going through, say, the budgeting process for next year, you have to be able to get to identifying that bottleneck or that one constraint as soon as you possibly can. and then, that really require data and technology, but, if you don't agree on a standardized set of, this is good data with which we can then identify the constraint, you end up this perpetual vicious cycle of indecision, which can be really costly for a business. So, what are you using to kind of get to that path faster in your organization of identifying that one constraint?
I think this is the only case in the world where consultants are useful. So, because it's so politically unacceptable to have only one constraint, because everybody wants to be important. Everybody wants their thing to get worked on, their thing to get budget, their thing to get attention. And by the way, the constraint's going to change probably 4 or 5 times next year if you're successful, because every time you do something about it, it moves. So you can't just budget for this constraint, but you do have to identify it. And it's really hard for teams to do that because the politics mitigates against it. This is the only thing consultants do that's of any real value, not bringing their expertise, but their independence. They don't care about the politics, hopefully, if you get a good one, and they'll force you to do the analysis and go, it's there. It's okay, it'll move, it'll be yours later, but right now we got to fix this one or we're stuck with this forever.
Yeah, Chris, I think the one thing that you said about your 7 seconds is, and I think this goes for everyone, but it's like, Chris, you say that and I'm sort of sitting here being like, wow, like that makes sense and it's true. And like I started thinking about that for our business. And I think the one thing that's really simple that you can do in turning insights into action is, Matt talked about buy-in, seeing is believing. A very large percentage of human beings actually believe in something more when there's data and numbers provided. So I would just say in general, like when you're doing these sort of research methods or you have a consultant come in, like don't be afraid to share that data with the person you're trying to drive that action. A lot of times it sort of feels nice to like hoard it or feel like something others don't, but I would really recommend against it. I think the biggest thing you can do is when you find that data, share with the person that you need to drive that action. Hey, just like for Chris's case, like we found out the first 7 seconds is extremely critical. And I've got this data to show you why it's critical that you're on the ball in the first 7 seconds of every phone call. So I think just don't sit on the data, share it with your team so they understand what you're asking them to do.
I love that, right? Because all data is subject to interpretation, right? It's all about perspective, right? Marketing and sales could look at the same, data point very, very differently on how they would define, an MQL versus an SQL, right? And so, at least by taking that approach, to your point of being transparent, and forthright in, hey, we're just trying to get to figuring out that one challenge and solving it, you will be far better off holistically as an organization. And this is where I think that, the sort of modern sales toolbox of, sales intelligence backed by data, is going to become really the sort of central nucleus of all playbooks, in years to come.
And I just, keep harping on the point of use the kinds of things that you can make real-time decisions really quickly with. So there's been some written up about campaign donation testing. And so if you've got 2 live streams asking for money and one says, please help, and the other one says, donate here, and one or the other of those is doubling the donation aspect, take the first one down and double down on your efforts. And so have the kind of action in the field that you can learn from and you can immediately pivot towards.
Yeah, that's brilliant.
Yeah,
By the way, one thing about data that I'd advise people that I'm an old scientist, right? I'm a physicist, mathematician by background. And in the sciences, we're always really careful before we declare something to be true about data. And you never start with an average. You never start with the mean. I am puzzled by serious business people starting from averages and trying to reason from that rather than looking at the actual data itself. Like I'm looking at some data right now on my screen. That's a team that we just trained for 1 hour and 25 minutes and 6 seconds each. And I could say, wow, on average, they converted at 15.84% after training on the first 7 seconds of the conversation. But you know what? 7 of them converted 0. So that average is meaningless. And unless you get below the averages and you look at the actual data, you're going to confuse yourself really badly. Very rare that a distribution looks like that. Most of them look like this in some funny way. And you compute an average, it's like, well, where's the average place in a street that's safe to walk? I don't know, right down the middle, I suppose, because both sidewalks are safe. Right down the middle, you get killed.
Chris, what a great point. The one I see companies mess up here all the time is the NPS score average. Averaging out your NPS score teaches you nothing about how to improve. Finding your detractors and understanding what made them a detractor is what you need to do. The only thing you should use your NPS score for is to find your detractors, because the average just hides the real problems.
I love it.
Yeah, it ends up being a lagging indicator, right, where you're not able to actually take the meaningful action in real time, you know, or something like that.
I think you're leading on to the last topic that we were going to discuss, Vivian, if you could just move forward to that, is if you take a look at, you know, this whole idea of let's go analyze where we're at in this little diagram, the one thing it says up there is revisit. It's not, again, one and done. So, you know, how do we go about creating a data-driven culture of continuous change, especially today when we say, hey, we want to go change, we're going to have to go to the CFO and say, by the way, change may come with a price tag on it. And, you know, so you also need to go in with a business case. One of the things that we've been seeing companies do is go start to figure out what's the cost of doing nothing. You know, so like I mentioned, the client that went from a 15% no decision rate to 30% decision rate. Well, you go to the CFO and you say, I need to spend money on training, on technology, on data, on something. They're going to say, can we hold off on that for a little while? And so where's your business case? Say, well, we're already writing a check out. It's a huge check called 15% no decision. And that's bigger than the cost of fixing the thing. So just kind of curious as to how you guys are within your own organization, or you're seeing other organizations going in and creating that culture shift. We've got to be constantly looking to challenge how we're doing things, constantly challenge what our customers are expecting from us, and how do we get that continuous change mindset into everybody's mind, not just in sales, but everybody in the company.
So one, you have to remove the fear factor. So the only way we're going to get to the heart or the truth of the matter of challenges that we have, you know, internally and solve them is that, you know, there's no looming anxiety around exposure to something that would negatively reflect on me. So, you know, to the previous point made, you know, you not hoarding information or keeping it to yourself, but, you know, being an open book and transparency. And that's really where the leadership comes in, you know, to understand that we want to be able to ultimately get to that better outcome. But to do so, it really is ensuring that we've got good data and access to that to make the decisions from which we can go forward with automation and other technology into a new plan.
It starts with
talk about nailing it. You nailed it.
Yeah, I agree.
I mean, really.
And no one's right? Like, oh, this is gonna, what's this going to expose? If I share this, you know, did I have a couple of months here where like I could have seen this sooner? You know, this is going to come back to me. You know, those things have to be able to get out in the open if we're ever going to solve them.
Yeah, leaders must exhibit curiosity continuously. And I think when people are in leadership roles, they tend to be looking for something to say, what the heck happened here? Whenever you want to say, what the heck happened here, turn that off and say, wow, that's interesting. Let's go find out more.
I think you're both hitting on something that gets to it, which is continuous improvement is a culture. In our business, it's one that's actually a named culture because we do it both internally as having software developers, but that's because how software works, right? It is, it's never done. You have to continuously improve on the feature set and the experience. That's just what the user expects at this point. Uber, I think, is one of them that releases dozens and dozens of software updates a day. If you think about how continuous improvement works. And so if you teach your employees that there is not a static, we've never arrived. This is a process by which we will be working on day after day and motion after motion in order to get better and adapt and evolve to the environment. I think you get at it from the culture. And then being open to that data and setting it up so that you have every expectation that you haven't arrived, that you're working towards some greater improvement, not summiting the mountain and succeeding at the top.
I think it's been talked about a few times too, but all this analysis on data and leaders, I mean, don't go into it all don't try to create this culture change and I think, Chris talked about it when he talked about the consultants, if you're not prepared to just understand that sometimes people will mess up, people are messing up, they're taking things for granted. So I think, if you want to create a culture change, you can't look at the data and ignore it because you're going to hurt someone's feelings. I think whatever the data does tell, and you want to create a culture of change, you need to be honest to the data and be consistent with that data. So basically doing whatever's best for the business that you work for. I've worked at previous places where data shows up and you're like, well, it's because of this. And I know before our call, a lot of things is sort of funny because I believe them too, but there's always excuses, right? But really, look at the data behind the excuses, right? If you want to create a culture of continuous change, there's data to everything. So are they excuses, or is that a legitimate data point of concern? So I just think, if you want to create a culture around data, it truly is not one that's based on preserving someone's feelings. So something just on the emotional side of leading people.
It's the fear of uncertainty, right? So you've got a scenario where you take something like AI even, right? Which, there's a shift towards this happening. There's a shift towards, that we call the modern sales toolbox and sales intelligence. And it's not what is it going to do for me necessarily, because you can read all of the, the marketing speak that's out there of, all the problems that it will solve for you overnight, which isn't the case. But, it's also the uncertainty of what will it show that I'm not expecting, right? And so I think, we all agree that there's two ingredients that allow for, unprecedented levels of change to be able to happen. Starts with culture and trust, but, data analysis and predictability, right? Leading to better segmentation, better targeting, better communication, better feedback loop with your customers, right? These are really the central sort of nucleus of going into 2021. How do you predict things that are unpredictable? Well, it comes back down to data and automation first.
Matt, you bring up something interesting. We have a question from one of the people here is watching the webinar, Callie. Talking about what other kinds of qualitative data do you have? You brought up AI, but she's bringing up, customer interviews by a third party is one source of ways of getting around, what can you arm your champions with to go ahead and get things pushed forward in their own companies on that. But there are other data sources like AI and things like that we could be turning to get additional insights. And what other qualitative data could we be getting? And similar to that is, we got a question here from Scott on what kind of data is lacking today that we should be getting more of. So kind of curious as to your thoughts, the panelists' thoughts on both of those topics.
Well, I'll just start by saying you can answer both of those by starting in one place, the CRM. Go back to the CRM, and what, is there's an abundance of data, depending on how long you've been utilizing, your instance or CRM, that I'm sure is either duplicative, or there's incomplete data, there's information that will be all over the place, lack of alignment across records, opportunities, accounts, leads, for example. So before you can begin sort of holistic improvement in all these other areas, you first have to start by actually finishing that job of saying, hey, let's clean up our CRM instance, get on the same sheet of music, and then from there, we can begin all these other improvements that we want to be able to make, because we know we're working off a quality set of original data in the CRM. That's the starting point, in my opinion.
So we're getting close to the end of the session. Just wanted to give everybody one last chance to say, if you wanted somebody to take one takeaway from what you heard today, why don't we start with you, Chris? What would it be? What's one last piece of advice you'd like to leave everybody with?
Be sufficiently curious. If you're in a leadership role, be sufficiently curious, encourage curiosity, and do it in the little ways and the big ways. Don't wait for the project to come along. I had an example from yesterday during a forecast call. I'm listening and somebody said something that, this is why this customer isn't going to renew. I was curious. I went to the data, looked at the actual numbers and said, I don't think that's correct, but I'm not sure. Let me share this. I'm curious about it. So as leaders, if we exhibit curiosity, we encourage curiosity, and we let the data then speak to us in an open way, and we got a pretty good shot of creating a culture of continuous change, and doing the stuff that counts and avoiding the stuff that's crap.
Heather?
I think from today, I'd suggest just make sure you're listening to your customer. It is really tempting to get internally focused and navel gaze and to make sure that we're doing the right processes internally and to completely forget why we're doing it. If your sales aren't as high as you want to, instead of only looking at the process and the people internally, look at your product, look at your value proposition, look at your market and talk to your customer. And make sure. And I think that in doing so, you might find a lot of value in working with marketing on that and the ability to attract customers to the product and to the value proposition, as well as the actual sales call itself.
Ma'am?
Yeah. And one final point from me would be, how do you avoid sales disablement in 2021? So if you're a modern sales leader, that means harnessing the power of good data to make good decisions and being open to collaborative selling, which means the involvement and opinions of all those in the organization, maybe even outside of sales, listening to the customer, for example. So avoid sales disablement by being open-minded in 2021.
And Brian?
I guess I'm next. I think, when you think about a data-driven culture, I think the one takeaway would be consistent and be, overly visible. So when you're gathering this data, from the very get-go of someone's onboarding, is this data in playbooks? Is it brought to the sales team for, running their demos or pitching the product? Does marketing have this data? Does the CFO have this data? So I just think being overly visible with that data, but you got to be consistent. So those are the big things I would take away from this.
Thank you. Well, we're approaching 15 minutes past the hour, which is the shut-off time for our session. So first off, I'd like to thank all the panelists for taking time today to share their ideas. I'd like to thank everybody for taking time out of your day to join us. And hopefully you're walking away with some ideas that, yes, this is crazy times, it's challenging times, but if we work together, we can all figure out new and innovative ways to sell and keep selling. So have a great day, and we'll wish you a great rest of the year.
Thank you.
Thanks.